When Jason and his team planned their exploration of the abandoned Glendale Hospital, they expected the usual urban legends and gloomy atmosphere to await them. But no one could have imagined that reality would turn out to be much scarier. Rumors of ghosts and strange sounds attracted the attention of many urban explorers and thrill seekers, but they always left with nothing but paranoid stories of rustling, creaking doors. However, Jason's group was different. They were going to conduct a scientific study. They have prepared carefully. Jason, an experienced journalist, took 2 of his colleagues with him. Ben, photographer with experience in extreme conditions, and Lisa, a young historian who spent a lot of time studying archives about abandoned places. They took high-tech equipment with them: night vision cameras, motion sensors, thermal imagers, as well as professional audio recorders to capture all the oddities they might stumble upon. The hospital building has been closed for more than 20 years. The last patient left in a hurry after a major scandal involving the disappearance of several patients who were never found. There were whispers in the old newspapers about illegal experiments, abuse, and silencing. City officials claimed that the hospital was closed due to lack of funding, but Lisa, who had gone through all the documents, knew that much darker secrets were hidden there. The group arrived at the building in the early evening, when the sun was already starting to set. Glendale Hospital towered over them, its facade covered with mold and cracks. The windows on the ground floors were blown out, and the roof seemed to sag under the weight of time. The dark corridors that permeated the building caused a feeling of deep anxiety. The walls were peeling, and the interior was collapsing under the influence of time and moisture. Just an abandoned building, no ghosts, Jason reassured his colleagues, although he felt his heart beating faster. Their main target was the basement. According to rumors, it was there that the strangest events took place. Patients complained of terrible screams coming from underground. Lisa found records indicating that part of the premises under the hospital was not used for treatment, but for some kind of unofficial medical experiments, possibly as part of secret government programs. When they went inside, Jason immediately felt a slight chill. It was not something supernatural. Rather, the building, unheated and not visited for years, absorbed the cold of the night. Floors creaked under their feet. Each step seemed louder than the last. Lisa immediately started taking notes and taking pictures, and Ben set up cameras around the perimeter, capture everything that could happen. As they passed through a long, poorly lit corridor, they noticed that almost every door was either boarded up or covered with chains. Jason bent down to look through one of the small windows and saw a medical ward inside. The table was covered with a layer of dust, but there were still old tools on it. There were beds in the corner, covered with rusted springs and ruined mattresses. Obviously, someone was hiding something here, Lisa remarked, looking at the long cracks on the walls and stains on the floor, which looked strange, as if something heavy had been dragged along them. When they reached the basement, the air became even more damp and stagnant. The remains of old medicines, empty vials, and moldy documents were scattered around. The basement was divided into several rooms: former operating rooms, equipment storage rooms, and old archives. Time seemed to stand still here. Furniture and objects were covered with a thick layer of dust, and the dampness smelled of mold. "There was something here," Ben said, examining one of the walls, which had strange markings on it. It was like something or someone was scratching her. "I don't think it's an animal," Lisa added thoughtfully, paying attention to the nature of the injuries. It looked like finger marks, although not quite ordinary ones. They continued their exploration, moving deeper into the basement. Wet footprints began to appear on the floor, although it had not rained for several days. The lights were flickering, their batteries were quickly running out, although all the equipment was charged before leaving. Tension grew. The worst was ahead of them. One of the doorways led into a small, almost imperceptible room. There were no inscriptions on the doors, and the inside was corroded. Inside, they found an old table covered with photographs and notes. The photos showed patients chained to their beds. Their faces were distorted with horror and suffering. Their eyes were covered with bandages. Their hands and feet were chained to metal holders. What was going on here? Lisa barely managed, flipping through the pages of an old magazine lying on the table. The notes described experiments on patients conducted without their consent. Doctors used people to test unknown substances and treatments, as a result of which many of the patients disappeared or died in terrible agony. One of these procedures was the study of nervous reactions under the influence of isolation and pain. Jason suddenly felt a sharp jolt of adrenaline. Something in these recordings looked too real. These photos and notes were evidence of crimes that had been hushed up for years. And so they found themselves in the middle of this horror. The team continued to go deeper into the basement, pushing through damp and moss-covered walls. Jason felt increasingly anxious. Something was wrong with this abandoned hospital. Not just its gloomy atmosphere or crumbling walls. Air itself seemed too dense, as if it was saturated with all the horrors that were happening. Ben was photographing strange footprints on the walls. Long, scratch-like prints. They were too high for a human and too level for an animal. Lisa plunged deeper and deeper into the magazines she found, barely catching her breath from what she read. According to these notes, they were tortured, she said in a trembling voice, looking from the magazine to Jason. They conducted experiments on patients to see how long a person could survive in isolation, how his mind would collapse under the influence of pain. Jason swallowed, peering at the papers on his desk. The notes were neat, with meticulous descriptions of procedures that range from injections of unknown substances to forced isolation in tiny, dark cells. The faces in the photographs attached to each report, distorted by horror and suffering, instilled deep horror in the soul. They never planned to let these people go, Ben added, looking at one of the photos. This is not a cure. This is pure violence. The sounds that previously seemed to be just the old man's moans of the building now began to intensify. A slight creaking, barely audible at the level of perception, became more pronounced. It seemed that with every step, something was quietly creeping behind. Suddenly, they heard a soft knock. All three of them froze. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, peering fearfully into the dim corridor. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if someone or something was sneaking closer in the dark. "Probably the wind," Ben tried to reassure her, but even his voice faltered. Jason looked at the wall where another photograph hung, almost hidden in shadow. It showed a man chained to a bed, with indistinctly visible bruises and traces of chains on his wrists. His face was hidden under a black mask. "Is there someone here?" Jason asked loudly, straining his ears. The answer was the same thud, this time closer and more distinct. Something heavy and clearly not the wind. The knocking turned into a long, barely audible rustle, as if something huge was moving across the dirty floor. They decided to go for the sound, trying to figure out what was going on. Jason's heart was pounding so loudly that he had difficulty focusing on what was happening. Their footsteps sounded in sync with the loud echoes piercing the empty corridors. Halfway to the source of the sound, Lisa suddenly stopped and screamed. "Wait." Her voice sounded harsh. She pointed to a small metal box, barely visible in the dust. It was firmly locked, but at Jason's touch, the lid suddenly gave way. There were old tapes and audio recordings inside. "What is it?" Lisa frowned, trying to read the dates on the stickers. One cassette stood out from the rest, marked, "Specially Important, Room 17. Ben quickly set up his portable camera and began recording everything that was happening. They turned on the tape. For the first few seconds, there was only noise and crackling on the recording. Then a voice, quiet and nervous, began to speak. "Patient 412 is showing incredible changes in behavior. Isolation and treatment methods have led to significant disturbances of consciousness. We record irreversible mental changes. It is important to continue observing." A loud scream followed. The tape suddenly stopped, leaving everyone in complete silence. The recording ended as abruptly as it had begun, but its contents were haunting. "Who is this patient 412? Lisa asked. There were no answers. The silence suddenly became unbearable, as if the air itself had become dense. Jason flinched when he heard the knock again, much closer this time. He looked around, but didn't notice anything that could make that sound. They decided to go to room 17, indicated on the tape. It was beyond reasonable, but the group was obsessed with finding out the truth. Every step along the corridor became more difficult. The air thickened, and faint sounds came from somewhere, as if someone was sneaking in the dark. Finally, they came to the door with the number 17. Rust covered the handle, but the door was unlocked. Creaked when Jason pushed it. The room was empty except for one item, an old armchair in the middle, bolted to the floor. The straps on the armrests and headrests spoke for themselves. It was a patient containment room. There were traces of attempts to escape on the walls, scratches, dents. Lisa pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing. Who was here, and what happened to him? Her voice sounded like an echo in an empty space. But they had barely begun their research when the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The room suddenly became stuffy, and even the rustling of the old walls seemed louder than usual. Lisa rushed to the door and tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. "We're locked up," she screamed in panic. Jason rushed to her aid, pushing the door with force, but to no avail. Ben, with the camera at the ready, tried to keep calm, but his hands were shaking so much that the video came out blurry. Panic began to build when they heard a quiet but constant knocking behind them, as if someone was slowly approaching. "It can't be the wind," Jason whispered, looking around the room. The silence that surrounded them was suddenly replaced by a sharp hum. From somewhere in the depths of the building, sounds like a roar or a metallic screech began to come. It was strange. There shouldn't be any functioning equipment in an abandoned hospital. "What is this place?" Lisa gasped, her voice trembling treacherously. They all froze as the pounding behind them grew louder and closer. Now it was not just a sound, but something physical that was literally felt in the air, like a vibration coming from the ground. Suddenly, dust fell from the ceiling, and the fluorescent lamps, which had barely flickered before, began to go out one by one. The room was plunging into darkness. Ben managed to turn on the flashlight on his camera, and its weak light picked out the battered furniture and walls from the darkness. But it was not enough to feel safe. "We need to get out of here." Jason didn't try to hide his panic. He went to the opposite wall and started looking for any way to open the door. To no avail. "Something is wrong with us here," Lisa whispered, barely moving. Her gaze was fixed on the chair in the middle of the room. Ben pointed the camera at the chair, and in the light of the lantern they noticed something they had not seen before. Words were scratched on the back of the chair, almost erased by time. The inscription was barely distinguishable, but with each passing second, they understood the meaning more clearly. "Don't look in the mirror." Jason froze. Lisa, looking around the room, noticed a large, dirty mirror on the wall opposite, covered with a layer of dust. It seemed unnoticeable until they looked at it. Its surface was strangely distorted, as if the reflection was unreal, crooked. It seemed that something was moving in it, but no one could tell what it was. Ben slowly approached the mirror, filming everything on camera. "It's not just dusty," he said, "cracked from the inside." Lisa jerked to the side, trying to stay away from the mirror. Jason tried to stop Ben, but he was already standing almost right next to him. Camera light picked out eerie details. The cracks looked like cobwebs, spreading from the center to the edges, and shadows seemed to move behind the cracks. And then the mirror suddenly cracked harder, as if something inside it began to move, breaking under pressure. Ben, approaching almost closely, stared in horror at his distorted reflection. A subtle movement in the glass caught his attention. It froze. It's not me," he muttered, taking a step back. At that moment, the mirror literally exploded. Shards flew across the room, and Ben fell to the floor, trying to cover his head. Jason and Lisa ducked to avoid the shards, but the strangest thing was ahead. Something rose from under the shards. At first, it seemed like a haze, but then they realized that it was ashes, or even a thin layer of old, almost tangible ashes. Lisa tried to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. Jason rushed to her to shield her from the flying fragments, and at that moment, they heard a sound that completely paralyzed them with fear. Something crashed into the corner of the room with a heavy thud, as if someone invisible had finally taken shape. Ben, still lying on the floor, raised his head with difficulty. Camera was pointed at the sound source. Something was moving slowly in the shadows, becoming more and more distinct. Ben slowly got to his feet, still trembling. Camera in his hands captured something moving in the corner, but the lens was too dusty to make out the details clearly. Jason and Lisa didn't dare take a step. All their attention was focused on what appeared in front of them. In the corner of the room, among the shards of mirror and dust, they finally saw. It was a human figure, but there was nothing alive about it. Her movements were abrupt, as if her every action was accompanied by incredible pain. The body was deformed, with bent arms and an unnaturally twisted neck. Face? Couldn't be called a face in the usual sense. The skin was stretched taut over the skull, and the eyes, empty and dead, seemed infinitely black. Someone took a step forward, and Lisa finally found the strength to scream. Jason immediately rushed to the door, trying to knock it down again, but his blows were in vain. Ben stood rooted to the spot, unable to take his eyes off the monster. This is what they left here, he muttered, recalling all those records they had found. It was the creation of experiments locked inside the walls of this hospital, something that should never have left its prison. The figure began to move faster. Her feet seemed to drag on the floor, but somehow she instantly closed the distance between herself and the group. Jason hit the door with all his might, and eventually the lock gave way. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand. They rushed down the corridor, but the sound of their footsteps quickly mixed with the approaching blows. Lisa stumbled, fell, and Jason pulled her to her feet. Ben was behind him, but he wasn't running anymore. He slowly stepped back, pointing the camera at the creature, which was now fully erect. Death was inevitable, and Ben knew it. He took one last look at his friends, who were already disappearing around the corner of the corridor. His hand tightened on the camera. "If I survive, let everyone see what we've found." Figure made a final leap forward. Camera flash lit up the room, but that light was too little. The camera fell out of his hands, hitting the floor, and blinked a couple of times before finally turning off. Jason and Lisa ran outside, gasping for air. Their hearts were racing. They turned around. The hospital was dark and silent, as if all the horrors were left behind its walls. They survived, but the Glendale Hospital took their friend with them, and his last moments were captured on camera.